There is a man in Britain worth close to £700 million. He owns nearly 800 pubs, but here's the strange part. He built it by refusing to do what every pub in this country relies on. No music, no sport, no advertising, nothing but the room itself. Even the name above the door is a joke, aimed at a teacher who once told him he'd never amount to anything. 47 years later, that joke pays close to £200 million a year in tax alone. Stay with me, the answer is almost insultingly simple. 1979. Tim Martin is 24 years old, freshly qualified as a barrister, and has decided, against every piece of sensible advice available to a young man with a law degree, that he would rather run a pub, not read briefs, not stand in wig and gown before a judge, pull pints. Before that decision, he'd led an unglamorous sort of life for a future multimillionaire. He'd worked a building site in Ware, Hertfordshire, hauling materials in weather that Hertfordshire rarely spares anyone. He'd sold advertising space for the Times, learning, whether he realised it at the time or not, exactly how persuasion works on people who don't particularly want to be persuaded. He understood, in the way that only someone who has actually done unglamorous work can understand, that most people's evenings out were built around two simple things: a decent pint and somewhere to sit where you could actually hear the person across the table. So he bought one pub, a single unremarkable site in Muswell Hill, and named it after the two least successful authority figures he could think of, a corrupt cartoon sheriff and a teacher who'd underestimated him. It was, on paper, the sort of decision that ends careers rather than launches them. Friends and family, by his own later admission, thought he'd lost the run of himself entirely. What Martin had actually identified, though it would take the rest of the industry the better part of 2 decades to notice, and some of it never did, was a gap nobody else was looking for. British pubs in the late 70s were, in the overwhelming majority, tied houses, shackled to a single brewery's beer, a single brewery's prices, and a single brewery's rather narrow idea of what an evening out was supposed to look like. There was no negotiating. There was no choice on the pumps. There was, in the truest sense, no competition at all within the 4 walls of most pubs in the country. Martin wanted none of it. He wanted a free house, unshackled from any single brewer, with control of his own taps and his own till. And he wanted, above everything else, volume, because volume, handled properly, is the only mechanism that lets you charge less than everybody around you and still walk away with a profit at the end of the week. It is simple arithmetic. It is also apparently arithmetic that took the rest of the British pub trade the best part of a generation to fully understand. By the early 90s, he had enough pubs trading well enough, and consistently enough, that the city began to take notice of the barrister who'd swapped his wig for a bar towel. In 1992, J.D. Wetherspoon floated on the London Stock Exchange. A barrister turned publican was almost overnight, a public company chairman answering to shareholders rather than simply his own instincts. And the capital that came with that listing did precisely what Martin intended it to do. It let him buy. Aggressively, methodically, and, this is the part competitors consistently underestimated, then and now, with almost no sentimental interest in what a building had originally been built for. Here is where the story gets properly interesting, because the genius of Wetherspoon was never really the beer. The beer, frankly, is unremarkable. A solid, honest, unpretentious pint, nothing more. The genius was the buildings. While every other pub chain was renting glossy units on the high street and hoping footfall alone would cover an ever-rising rent, Martin went hunting for the things nobody else wanted. Disused banks with their marble counters still intact, the vault sitting empty beneath the beer garden. Old cinemas with their sweeping sightlines and ornate ceiling roses still catching the light exactly as they had in 1930. Former churches, their stained glass repurposed above a fruit machine that, in a Wetherspoon, simply wouldn't be there. A department store here, a former public swimming baths there. Buildings that were, by conventional retail logic, entirely useless. Too large, too awkward, too tangled up in listed building consent, too expensive to heat through a British winter to be worth the bother for anyone sensible. Martin bought them anyway, and often during downturns when nobody else had the appetite or the spare capital to compete for a crumbling Edwardian bank on the high street. He converted them into pubs that averaged 5,000 to 10,000 square feet, roughly 5 times the size of the industry standard, with the sort of scale that meant a Wetherspoon rarely felt cramped, even on a Friday night when half the town had decided to have the same idea at once. Bigger sites meant more covers. More covers meant lower prices could still generate a healthy margin. And the architecture, the marble, the mosaics, the soaring plaster ceilings, did something no marketing budget could ever quite buy. It gave a pub selling a £2 something pint the unmistakable grandeur of a building that used to matter to the town it stood in. You could sip a pint of ale in a former Methodist chapel, beneath a ceiling that once amplified hymns, and feel, however fleetingly, however absurdly, that you were participating in something with a bit of history attached to it. It is, in its own understated way, a very British form of theatre. Then came the part that genuinely baffled the rest of the trade, and still does, if you ask certain rival landlords over a quiet pint of their own, what Wetherspoon deliberately chose not to spend money on. No music licenses, no Sky Sports subscription, with its eye-watering annual fees, no fruit machines lighting up in the corner, no jukebox demanding 50 pence a song, no big screen bellowing football commentary over the top of every conversation in the room. To a traditional publican, trained to believe that entertainment is what fills seats, this looked like commercial suicide. Strip out the noise, the theory went, and surely the punters simply go elsewhere in search of it. They didn't, because what Martin had actually built, almost by subtraction, was a room where conversation was genuinely possible again, where a pensioner having a £2 breakfast and a pint of mild at 9:30 in the morning wasn't competing with a Sky Sports pundit shouting over the top of him, where students on a Thursday curry night could actually hear one another across a crowded table without leaning in and shouting. The absence of noise wasn't merely a cost-saving dressed up afterwards as a virtue, though it was certainly that too, and a considerable one. It was in itself the product. Silence, or something close enough to it, turned out to be worth paying for. Every saving from the licenses he refused to pay for, the advertising he declined to buy, and the bulk supply deals he negotiated across a rapidly growing estate went into precisely one place: the price on the pump and the price on the plate. A Wetherspoon pint has, for the better part of 4 decades now, undercut almost everything within walking distance of it. Not by a little. By enough that an entire generation of British drinkers, students stretching a loan, pensioners stretching a pension, office workers marking the end of a Friday, families gathering for a Sunday roast that wouldn't dent the weekly shop, built entire routines around it. The Thursday curry club, the morning breakfast menu that opens before most cafes have switched their lights on. The Real Ale Festival that the company itself claims makes it the single biggest investor in craft beer in the country. None of it accidental. All of it engineered around the same founding principle: remove the cost, keep the room, pass the saving directly to the person holding the glass. By the turn of the millennium, Wetherspoon had passed 300 pubs and showed no sign whatsoever of slowing down. It kept expanding through recessions that quietly closed entire rival chains. It adopted a voluntary smoking ban across its estate, years before the law eventually forced everyone else's hand. A decision that, at the time, seemed almost self-destructive, and which turned out once again to be years ahead of where the rest of the trade was heading. And it kept growing straight through the 2008 financial crisis, a moment that should, by every conventional measure available to an analyst, have crippled a business built on razor-thin margins and expanding property holdings. It didn't crumble, because the property Martin had been quietly accumulating, often freehold, often bought below market value in the depths of a downturn nobody else had the stomach for, was appreciating in value the entire time he was pouring cheap pints on top of it. While competitors leased their premises and watched punishing rent reviews eat their margins alive year after year, Wetherspoon increasingly owned the ground beneath its own feet, in the same way a family might own a farmhouse outright, rather than lease it from a landlord who could raise the terms whenever the market allowed. It is, if you squint at it from the right angle, precisely the same trick the English aristocracy has been running for centuries. Buy the land, let everything built on top of it be secondary, and let time do the rest of the work. Martin, the barrister's son from Norwich by way of Belfast and Auckland, had arrived via building sites and advertising sales rather than inheritance, at exactly the conclusion the old estates arrived at generations before him. Bricks and mortar outlast fashion. Fashion, in hospitality especially, is expensive and fickle. Land mostly just sits there quietly becoming worth more. The estate kept growing. It opened its first hotel rooms above working pubs, 56 of them by 2025, unglamorous but consistently rated highly for value, on occasion outscoring Premier Inn in consumer surveys for money spent versus comfort received. It launched Lloyd's #1 bars as a distinct sub-brand for the sites that didn't quite fit the standard mould. It crossed into Ireland in 2019 with its first pub in Blackrock, Dublin, and by 2026 had opened its first site in Spain, offering garlic prawns and a pint from 6 in the morning to British holidaymakers who evidently wanted their Torremolinos to feel a little like their Tuesday night back home. Not every expansion held. Wetherspoon has never been sentimental about a site that stops earning its keep. The Sir John Sterling Maxwell in Glasgow closed, but 7 other Wetherspoon pubs remained within the same city for drinkers to choose from instead. The Knights Templar, tucked just off the Strand in London and surrounded by high-earning lawyers and bankers who, it transpired, weren't particularly interested in a value-led pub offering, was quietly sold off. This is not a company sentimentally wedded to bricks for their own sake. It is a company that treats every site, however handsome the conversion, as a piece of working capital that has to justify its own existence. By 2025, the estate stood at close to 800 pubs across the UK and Ireland. Revenue for the year to July that year came in at £2.12 billion, up 4.5% on the year before. And in a trading update that only Martin could have delivered, with quite that combination of pride and provocation, he made the sort of claim that only a man entirely unbothered by modesty offers up in public, that Wetherspoon alone generated roughly £1 in every 1,000 of all UK tax revenue in that financial year. The country, he suggested, would need only about 1,000 companies like his, and nobody else would ever need to pay a penny of tax again. It is, whatever else you think of it, a genuinely remarkable thing for a man to say about a business that started with one pub named after a private joke at a schoolteacher's expense. You cannot tell this story properly without the beer mats. In 2016, Martin threw his considerable weight and a very considerable cheque, some £200,000 of his own money, behind the Vote Leave campaign. He printed millions of Brexit-themed beer mats and distributed them right across the estate, prompting an actual parliamentary question about whether he'd overstepped electoral law by doing so. He hadn't, or at least it was never conclusively proven that he had, but the episode tells you everything about how Martin operates. He does not politely separate the pub from the politics, the way most sensible chief executives are trained to. He puts the argument directly on the table alongside the curry club menu and lets the customer decide, glass in hand, whether they mind sharing a room with an opinion they might disagree with. Extraordinarily, most of them didn't mind at all. Wetherspoon's customer base skews as broadly across British society as almost any brand in the country. Students who couldn't care less about tariffs, pensioners who care rather a lot, tradesmen grabbing lunch between jobs, families in for a Sunday roast that won't dent the weekly shop. Martin's habit of putting his own opinions on the table, on Brexit, on the minimum wage, on VAT parity between pubs and supermarkets, more recently on Reform UK's proposals to slash tax on the trade entirely, should, by every rule of modern brand management taught in any business school, have alienated a sizable chunk of that audience. It didn't. If anything, it did rather the opposite. It made him the single most recognisable face in British pubs, a man whose opinions get quoted in the national press with a regularity most trade body chairmen would frankly kill for, and whose warnings about rising business rates and national insurance contributions are treated, rightly or wrongly, as something close to an industry weather forecast. He deleted every one of Wetherspoon's social media accounts in 2018 in one clean sweep, citing the trolling of MPs and others as his stated reason, and simply walked away from the platforms his competitors were pouring fortunes into mastering. The free publicity kept arriving regardless, because journalists had long since learned that Tim Martin, asked a direct question over the phone, gives a direct and reliably quotable answer, no press office required, none of which is to say the company's history is spotless. It isn't, and pretending otherwise would insult your intelligence rather than respect it. In 2015, Wetherspoon was ordered to pay damages after a court found direct racial discrimination against a group of Irish travellers, and English gypsies refused admission to one of its London pubs, a judgment the company did not contest, and one that sits uncomfortably alongside the brand's broader claim to be the most democratic room on the high street. It is worth holding both things in your head at once. A business that genuinely opened its doors wider than almost anyone else in British hospitality, and one that, on at least one occasion, closed them in a way that fell well short of its own stated principles. And this is exactly the point in the story, where most channels ask you for something, so let's not pretend otherwise. If you're finding Martin's story as strange and as quietly brilliant as I am, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, drop a comment below with your best or worst Spoon's memory, and give this one a like before we press on. because what happens next very nearly finished the entire thing. 2020 arrived, and with it, the single greatest threat Wetherspoon had ever faced in its 4-decade history. Pubs across the country were ordered shut by government decree, in some cases for the better part of a year. A business built entirely, structurally, around getting large numbers of people into a large room together was suddenly, overnight, illegal by design. No amount of clever property strategy or bulk buying leverage was any use against a padlocked front door. Martin's early handling of the crisis did him no favours whatsoever in the press. Comments suggesting furloughed staff might find temporary work in supermarkets during the initial lockdown drew genuine, sustained criticism, and for a period the company's public image took a battering that no amount of cheap beer could quietly fix. Whatever your view of the substance of those remarks, they landed badly. And Martin, a man rarely short of an opinion, spent an uncomfortable stretch being defined by one he perhaps wished he'd phrased differently. The business bled money for 3 consecutive years, 2020 through 2022. A loss-making stretch that would have genuinely finished a company with less freehold property sitting quietly underneath it as collateral, and less patience among its shareholders for a chairman who has never been shy about telling them exactly what he thinks regardless of whether it's fashionable. But the recovery, when it finally came, was genuinely instructive, and arguably the most Martin-esque chapter in the entire story. Wetherspoon didn't claw its way back to profitability by squeezing costs at the expense of the people actually pulling the pints. It paid out £36 million in bonuses and free shares in a single comeback year, with nearly 99% of that sum going to staff below board level, not the executives at the top, but the bar staff, the kitchen porters, the cleaners who'd spent 3 years watching the company. They worked for hemorrhage, money around them. It cut its own direct carbon emissions by close to 60% over a decade, largely through a full switch to renewable energy across the estate, and picked up the Sustainable Restaurant Association's top rating for its trouble. It has over the years raised more than £23 million for the children's charity Young Lives vs Cancer through in-pub fundraising, the sort of unglamorous, unshowy community giving that never makes a press release, but adds up, pub by pub, into something substantial. By the year to July 2025, Wetherspoon posted profit before tax of £81.4 million and reinstated the dividend it had been forced to suspend through the worst of the crisis. The pub industry around it was, in places, still on its knees. Rival group Stonegate, owner of Slug and Lettuce, and Yates's among others, remained deep in the red, still nursing losses of well over £100 million. Wetherspoon was not merely surviving that same storm, it was expanding into Spain. There's a particular kind of British institution that becomes so ordinary, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of a Friday night or a Sunday morning, that we forget entirely how strange its origin story actually is. A barrister who never argued a single case in a courtroom, a pub named as a private joke at a teacher's expense, borrowed from a cartoon villain nobody involved ever expected to matter. A business model built almost entirely on the things everyone else in the trade assumed you absolutely needed: the music, the sport, the glossy units on the high street, and which Martin decided, quite deliberately and against every conventional instinct, that you simply didn't. That's the real story here. Not the tax bill, remarkable as it undeniably is. Not the knighthood, or the Spanish expansion, or the £2 billion turnover, or the 56 hotels tucked above working pubs from Dublin to Devon. It's that a man built one of the most valuable pub companies these islands have ever produced by trusting, more consistently than almost anyone else, in British hospitality, that ordinary people mostly just want somewhere decent and quiet to sit, a fair price on the pint in front of them, and enough peace to actually hear the person sitting opposite. If you've enjoyed this one, do hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. There's a great deal more of these stories coming, the sort that turn out to be far stranger, and far more calculated than the version most people think they already know. And do drop a comment below. We'd genuinely love to hear it. What's your local spoons, and what do you happen to know used to stand there before it? Thank you, as always, for watching.